When history becomes analog horror, the past stops being a collection of neatly arranged facts inside textbooks and becomes instead a flickering signal, a haunting presence that refuses to stay still. It no longer exists as dusty archives or monuments frozen in time, but as distorted recordings, warped voices, and images that bleed through static. The unsettling part about this transformation is not only the reminder that history is filled with suffering, fear, and unanswered questions, but also that when it is reframed through analog horror, it ceases to feel distant. It becomes alive again, not as nostalgia but as an intrusion, as if something buried long ago has managed to broadcast itself back into the present, demanding attention in a way that is uncanny, uncomfortable, and impossible to ignore. There is a reason why the aesthetic of analog horror, with its grainy VHS textures, corrupted audio, and late-night public service announcement atmosphere, resonates so strongly when tied to historical events. Old footage already carries with it the weight of the past, but when reimagined through an analog horror lens, those moments are stripped of their clarity and repurposed into experiences that feel more like hauntings than lessons. A war broadcast becomes not just news but a transmission from another world. A presidential speech distorted through static turns into a warning rather than a reassurance. A grainy photo of a vanished town is no longer just a document but a relic that pulses with dread, as if the people who live there have been swallowed not only by time but by something much darker, something inexplicable. The unsettling appeal of this form lies in how it forces us to confront history as a living, breathing entity rather than a sealed-off narrative. In school, history is often taught as a series of events with clear beginnings and endings. But reality was never so neat. Wars did not end with clean resolutions, people did not vanish with tidy explanations, and disasters left scars that were both physical and psychological. When history is retold in analog horror style, all of those unresolved fragments resurface, magnified by the lo-fi aesthetics of degraded media. The blur of an old film reel can make a figure look less like a soldier and more like a ghost. The warbling sound of a damaged tape can turn a simple statement into a cryptic warning. And in that distortion, truth and fiction collapse into one another, reminding us that history is never as stable as we want to believe. Imagine, for example, the infamous moments of the 20th century not through pristine documentaries but through corrupted archival broadcasts. The moon landing footage, already grainy and otherworldly, could easily take on an ominous tone if intercut with brief flashes of unknown symbols, or if Neil Armstrong's words faltered into fragmented, unintelligible syllables, as though something interfered with the transmission from beyond. The fall of the Berlin Wall, usually celebrated as triumph, could be reframed as an unsettling rupture, with static interruptions suggesting that while one barrier fell, another unseen barrier rose in its place. Even the calm voice of a newscaster during the Cuban Missile Crisis could be rendered terrifying by simply distorting the tape, so that his words about missiles and submarines sound more like a prophecy than a report. This is the power of analog horror applied to history. It destabilizes what we thought we knew, forcing us to question whether the past was ever safe to begin with. Analog horror thrives on the fear of signals, transmissions, and interruptions. It thrives on the uncanny moment when familiar media feels hostile, when a TV screen stops being a window into the world and starts being a portal into something we shouldn't see. When placed against the backdrop of history, these tropes take on an amplified weight because so much of our understanding of the past is mediated through recordings and broadcasts. We never experienced the Normandy landings firsthand, we know them through newsreels. We did not hear FDR's speeches live, we hear them through preserved audio. But if those media sources are corrupted, if they flicker with static or bleed with impossible images, then history itself feels corrupted. It becomes not just a timeline but a living nightmare that is replaying itself through faulty equipment, daring us to keep watching even when we should turn away. There is also a deeper psychological reason why history reframed as analog horror resonates. The analog era itself is associated with a transitional moment in human communication. It was the bridge between the raw physicality of print and the invisible ubiquity of digital. Analog technology felt tactile. You could hold a VHS tape, rewind it, hear the whir of the machine. You could feel the magnetic tape resisting as it aged, warping the images stored within. When history is played back through these aging formats, it feels fragile, as if the truth itself could crumble if the tape breaks. That fragility mirrors the way memory itself works. History is not a perfect recording but a damaged reel, spliced together by survivors and witnesses, subject to distortion with each retelling. Analog horror makes that metaphor literal, forcing us to see the cracks in the narrative. Consider the chilling potential of historical tragedies reframed through this lens. The Titanic disaster, often romanticized, could be presented as a broken radio transmission, where distress calls fade into static, punctuated by eerie gaps in which voices whisper things never recorded. The Great Depression could be depicted not as numbers and charts but as flickering black and white government films where the subjects' faces appear blurred, their mouths moving but their words lost, suggesting that suffering was more widespread and inexpressible than official records ever captured. Even the assassination of JFK, a moment already surrounded by endless conspiracy theories, could be amplified by analog distortion, frames missing from the Zapruder film, ghostly figures appearing where they shouldn't be, audio popping as though something wants to speak from beneath the recording. What makes this approach so potent is that it refuses closure. Traditional history books assure us that events have endings. Wars end, disasters resolve, and people move on. Analog horror resists that comfort. It suggests that the echoes of those moments never ended, that they still linger in forgotten frequencies, replaying themselves endlessly in static, waiting for someone to tune in. This lack of resolution mirrors the real human experience of trauma. For those who lived through war or disaster, the past never ends cleanly, it intrudes into the present through nightmares, memories, and sensations that feel just as real decades later. Analog horror externalizes that experience, turning history into an ongoing broadcast of unresolved fear. There is also something to be said about the democratization of history through analog horror. Traditional history is curated, polished, and presented through authoritative voices. But analog horror, with its found footage aesthetic, suggests that anyone might stumble across pieces of the past accidentally. A person might find an unlabeled VHS tape in an attic, pop it into an old player, and suddenly confront images that were never meant to be seen. A student searching archives might hear voices layered beneath the official recording, whispering a version of events that contradicts the textbooks. This decentralization of history reflects the reality that there are countless untold stories buried beneath the official record, stories of the marginalized, the forgotten, the silenced. When history becomes analog horror, those lost voices can emerge, not through neat documentation but through glitchy intrusions that feel wrong precisely because they disrupt the sanctioned narrative. But there is danger here too. Just as analog horror thrives on distortion, so too can distortion breed misinformation. If history becomes a horror aesthetic, the line between truth and invention blurs. While this can be artistically powerful, it also reflects the darker side of memory and media. Conspiracy theories thrive on similar tactics, taking fragments of real events and reframing them with ominous tones until they feel monstrous. When we imagine history through the lens of analog horror, we are forced to confront this uncomfortable truth, that the way we present the past can change not only how it is remembered but how it is believed. A corrupted broadcast can be mistaken for prophecy, and a missing frame can suggest a cover-up. The aesthetic that makes analog horror so chilling is the same mechanism that makes misinformation so dangerous. And yet, perhaps this is why it resonates so much with audiences. The digital age has flooded us with pristine information, endless archives, and polished narratives. But deep down, we know that beneath those polished surfaces lie fractures. We know that the past was never neat, and that behind every clean documentary is a sea of forgotten terror, grief, and silence. Analog horror allows us to feel that truth viscerally. It strips away the illusion of clarity and forces us to engage with the past as something unstable, unfinished, and deeply uncanny. When history becomes analog horror, it becomes personal. It becomes the unsettling feeling that the past is not over, that it has seeped into the static between channels, into the warble of a half-erased tape, into the gaps between official narratives. It reminds us that the ghosts of history are not resting quietly in textbooks, they are waiting in the static, flickering on old screens, bleeding through forgotten frequencies. And perhaps the most frightening thing is not what those ghosts might show us, but that they are simply reminding us of what we already know, That history itself is horror, that the suffering of the past never truly ended, and that every attempt to replay it will always carry the distortion of loss, fear, and things left unsaid. Because in the end, history is not a clean archive. It is a haunted broadcast. It is a signal that never stops transmitting. It is a voice calling through the static, daring us to listen. And when we do, we discover that the scariest thing is not the monsters of fiction, but the realization that the past itself, replayed through analog fragments, was always monstrous enough. When history becomes analog horror, it changes from being a neat timeline into something messy, alive, and unsettling. Normally, history is taught as a record of facts, dates, names, events, all tied together in a structured way. But when reframed through the eerie lens of analog horror, history loses its clean edges and becomes a haunting presence that feels unfinished. It's no longer about what happened but about what still echoes. The static-filled broadcasts, glitching images, and warped voices act as reminders that history doesn't always rest in peace. Wars, disasters, and tragedies don't just stay confined to the past, they leave scars that can reappear at any time in strange, ghostly forms. Analog horror strips away the comforting illusion that the past is over, instead presenting it as something actively intruding on the present. It becomes less about nostalgia and more about intrusion, as though history itself is trying to break through the static of memory to remind us of what we want to forget. This core concept explains why the marriage of history and analog horror feels so powerful. It makes the past into something alive, uncanny, and terrifyingly relevant. The analog medium is inherently fragile, imperfect, and uncanny, which is why it pairs so naturally with horror. Unlike digital, which feels polished and permanent, analog formats, VHS tapes, film reels, audio cassettes, broadcast signals, deteriorate with time. That very deterioration is where the horror emerges. A VHS tape begins to warp, turning a person's face into an unrecognizable blur. An old film reel develops scratches that seem to carve strange patterns across historical footage. A radio broadcast begins to crackle with static, with ghostly voices seeping through the noise. All of these imperfections suggest that something is hiding within the medium itself, waiting to emerge. When applied to history, these flaws are amplified. We don't just see the past, we see it decayed, corrupted, and distorted in ways that feel unnatural. This aesthetic amplifies unease because it mixes familiarity with distortion. People recognize the look of old media, but when it warps, it feels as though the medium is revealing secrets never meant to be known. That unsettling tension between familiar and strange makes analog aesthetics a perfect tool for reimagining history as something horrifying rather than something safe. Analog horror reframing of history taps into the psychological truth that trauma never ends cleanly. People who lived through disasters or wars carry those memories with them forever. They resurface in dreams, flashes, and sensations. Analog horror externalizes that feeling by presenting history itself as something replaying endlessly through broken signals. Watching a flickering tape of a historic event is unnerving because it mirrors how human memory functions, fragmented, unreliable, and haunting. It creates the sensation that the past isn't behind us but is still alive, still broadcasting into our world. That has a profound psychological effect. It makes viewers feel as though they are not just observers of history but participants in its ongoing nightmare. Even those who never lived through an event can feel its trauma bleed into the present through warped media. This is why analog horror resonates. It doesn't let history feel like something you can close the book on. Instead, it transforms it into an experience that unsettles you emotionally, as though the ghosts of the past are speaking directly to you through static and distortion. It captures the essence of living with trauma, the sense that the past is never fully gone. The potential to reimagine history through analog horror is vast. Take the moon landing, a moment celebrated as human triumph. In clean footage, it's inspiring. But through analog horror, the flickering broadcast could distort Neil Armstrong's words into fragmented syllables, with strange shapes flickering in the static behind him, suggesting something went wrong on the lunar surface. The Titanic disaster, often dramatized in romance and tragedy, could be reframed as an eerie transmission of distress calls fading into whispers, as though voices of the dead still echo across the Atlantic. World War II broadcasts could be portrayed as interrupted signals where soldiers' voices bleed through in impossible ways, as if time itself refuses to contain the scale of suffering. JFK's assassination film, already filled with conspiracy, could be corrupted with missing frames that hint at figures appearing and disappearing where they shouldn't be. These examples show how analog horror doesn't need to invent monsters, history itself provides enough darkness. By layering distortion over real events, it transforms them into transmissions of dread, leaving audiences to question whether what they are seeing is real history, a trick of the medium, or something else entirely that cannot be explained. One of the most powerful aspects of analog horror applied to history is how it disrupts the neatness of traditional narratives. History books and documentaries often present events as though they are contained stories with beginnings, middles, and ends. Wars end, treaties are signed, disasters are resolved. But reality is never so clean. Trauma lingers, injustices remain unresolved, and suffering continues far beyond the official end. Analog horror embodies this messiness. A tape doesn't end neatly, it skips, warps, repeats, or cuts off at the worst possible moment. That disruption mirrors how history actually feels to those who lived through it, unfinished, fragmented, and unresolved. It denies the viewer closure. When a broadcast about the end of a war suddenly cuts to static and impossible imagery, it suggests that the suffering never truly ended, that something unspoken remains. This narrative disruption is deeply unsettling because it reflects a truth people try to avoid: the past is not sealed away. The analog format itself becomes a metaphor for history's refusal to stay still. It turns history from a stable narrative into a nightmare that refuses to end, one that keeps replaying until someone dares to look away. Analog horror also opens the door to reintroducing voices that history often silenced. Traditional history is curated by those in power, focusing on leaders, victories, and dominant narratives. But many voices, the marginalized, the oppressed, the forgotten, were left out of the official record. Analog horror, with its found footage style, disrupts that authority. Imagine an unlabeled VHS tape found in an attic, revealing not the speeches of presidents but the distorted images of ordinary people who lived through oppression. Imagine a government broadcast where ghostly voices whisper truths about massacres or betrayals that were never recorded officially. These eerie intrusions give form to the idea that the past is not just what we're told, it's also what was deliberately hidden. By surfacing lost voices through glitch and distortion, analog horror democratizes history. It gives space to those who were erased, not through neat storytelling but through unsettling intrusions that feel wrong precisely because they break the official narrative. This is why analog horror is so powerful as a metaphor. It reminds us that the past is full of missing pieces, and sometimes those missing pieces claw their way back through static to demand recognition. One of the core dangers, and appeals, of analog horror applied to history is how easily it blurs truth and fiction. By design, analog horror thrives on distortion, missing frames, corrupted signals, and eerie intrusions. This makes it incredibly effective as an art form but also deeply unsettling because it mirrors how misinformation works. A corrupted broadcast can look like hidden truth. A missing frame in a film can suggest a cover-up. When applied to real history, this blurring forces audiences to question what they are seeing. Is it real footage or something altered? Is the horror embedded in the event itself, or is it being created through distortion? This uncertainty reflects the way conspiracy theories take root, by warping reality until people doubt the official record. Analog horror as an art form thrives on that ambiguity, leaving people unsettled because they cannot separate fact from invention. In doing so, it mirrors the way collective memory works: fragmented, unclear, vulnerable to manipulation. This blurring is frightening because it destabilizes not just our trust in media but our trust in history itself, suggesting that even the past cannot be relied upon to tell the truth. The reason analog horror resonates so strongly in today's culture is because we live in an era of polished digital perfection. Every video is crystal clear, every broadcast is smooth, and every archive is organized. Yet, deep down, we know that reality isn't that perfect. The analog era feels more authentic because it carries the imperfections of time, the scratches, the static, the warping. These imperfections feel closer to memory, which is itself flawed and fragmented. By reframing history in analog horror style, creators tap into this longing for authenticity, even if that authenticity is terrifying. The uncanny familiarity of VHS tapes or static-filled broadcasts creates nostalgia mixed with dread. People remember growing up with this media, but when it's warped, it feels like their childhood itself has been corrupted. This cultural resonance is why analog horror thrives on platforms like YouTube and TikTok. It connects with an audience that is both nostalgic for the analog era and suspicious of overly polished digital narratives. By making history feel glitchy, unstable, and haunted, analog horror resonates with modern audiences who already suspect that the past is more complicated than official stories suggest. The ultimate fear at the heart of history as analog horror is not the monsters invented by distortion but the realization that real history was horrifying enough. When you see a static-filled broadcast of war, you don't need ghosts to make it terrifying, the reality was already monstrous. Analog horror amplifies this truth by reminding us that history is full of suffering, violence, and trauma that no amount of clean documentation can sanitize. What makes it unsettling is how familiar and yet alien these events feel when replayed through distorted media. They are recognizable enough to feel real but strange enough to feel wrong, which makes them uncanny. This reveals a deeper truth. We fear not the unknown but the too well-known, the moments of human cruelty and tragedy that remind us what we are capable of. Analog horror doesn't invent fear, it reflects it. It shows us that the past, when stripped of comforting narratives, was always horror. And the scariest part is realizing that the ghosts in the static aren't supernatural at all, they are human, and they are us. Ultimately, when history becomes analog horror, it becomes more than an artistic aesthetic. It becomes a metaphor for the instability of truth, the persistence of trauma, and the haunting nature of memory. History is not a sealed archive but a living broadcast, constantly replaying through the cracks of media and memory. The analog medium, with its static, warping, and fragility, captures this perfectly, reminding us that nothing in the past is truly fixed. Every event is subject to distortion, every narrative is vulnerable to manipulation, and every memory is prone to haunting. This overall theme explains why analog horror tied to history feels so powerful. It speaks to the collective unease we have about the past and its ability to intrude into the present. It forces us to reckon with the fact that the past is never really gone, that it lingers in signals and stories waiting to resurface. And when it does, it doesn't return as a clean documentary, it returns as a haunting, distorted broadcast that dares us to look closer and accept that history itself is the most horrifying story of all.